Wonderful. So let's get rolling. Has everybody looked at the little package of stuff in their seat, and has everyone seen a card with a thumbs up and thumbs down? Can everybody hold that up? Awesome. That's great. And if you don't have a thumbs up or thumbs down card, you'll be escorted from the room. So let's get right into this. And this is about Canada's digital future. This affects all of us, all of you. This is all about where we're going with this piece. And we thought it was a wonderful oeuvre for the whole conference. And I encourage all of you to participate and to allow your voices to be heard as well with these issues. I'll be calling upon you to use those cards. But equally, we are interested, if there are voices from the floor, to opine on some of the issues that we're discussing. So I'd like to, if I could, cue the first slide. We're going to debate, in effect, three main issues here, which stem from the caption that you read in the guidebook and on the web in terms of what this session is all about. And the first question is, if it were your decision, if you were the regulator, and we all saw this week how the regulator has decided to not regulate the internet, at least for the next 5 years per se, but if it were your decision, how would you address new media regulation? And I'd like to start that with a show of hands. How many people think that the internet should be regulated, with your thumbs up or thumbs down? What do you say, everybody? What does it look like?
Pretty strongly disagree.
Pretty strong disagreement. So no regulation. Michael, let's start with you. Maybe you can give us an overview of what transpired this week and get this debate underway.
Sure. It strikes me this may be one of the first times everyone in the room seems to agree with the CRTC. So just to clarify, so as I'm sure almost everybody here knows, the CRTC conducted new media hearings earlier this year in February and came out with a decision, I think, really quickly, given that they came out this week. And their decision was to essentially follow what they did, to follow much what they said 10 years ago, which was that under the current statute, under the Broadcasting Act, regulation of new media, it's not really regulation of the internet, they're always quite careful about that, regulation of new media isn't appropriate in the way that the Act is set out, with a couple of provisos now. One is this question of whether or not internet service providers could be captured under that Act as opposed to the Telecommunications Act. So that's actually what they referred to the court. It's not quite the network management, traffic shaping related issues. That'll be the subject of a hearing in just a few weeks' time. The provisos are a couple. One, that they've now referred to the courts, the question of whether or not ISPs fall under that Broadcasting Act, so Federal Court of Appeal will take a look at that. The other thing that they did was, I think we're quite sympathetic to some presentations that were made by a number of content owners, particularly Palmorex, which runs the Weather Network, about concerns in the wireless space where there may be undue preferences being granted to certain kinds of content over other kinds of content. And we're concerned that there might be a hole in the current law for that kind of activity. And so I've put forward the notion of establishing an undue preferences provision to stop some of that kind of activity from taking place, which I think is a good thing. The other thing that they've done is they've also said they're going to revisit this yet again, as long as 5 years, but perhaps sooner. But perhaps most importantly, and it works very nicely within the context of the debate or discussion we're going to have here today, is that they've said quite clearly that there are problems fundamentally with the structure that they're facing, right? So they've got the Telecommunications Act, they've got the Broadcasting Act, and then there's the internet. And if you were to read anything in this decision, I'd actually encourage you to read the concurrence from Tim Denton. It's a bit of a rant, but Denton, I think, articulates in a very powerful way that at the end of the day, we're talking about free speech, about the importance of preserving that free speech and not using regulation to get in the way, and that the internet isn't broadcast and it isn't telecommunications. It's neither. It's the internet. And what we need are, if we're going to have regulations, we need regulations that suit that kind of environment. And so that's where some of this talk about a digital strategy begins to come in.
Sarah, how would you address the subject of internet regulation if your name was Conrad von Finkenstein?
Well, I've long been a proponent of not regulating the internet. I actually agree with Michael's comments, but I think it's really, and it's really critical though for us to recognize that we're at a kind of crisis point around the internet where we're facing the potential of walled gardens, depending on what happens with net neutrality and with network management. So I actually think that those questions need to be addressed at the same time as we look at the qualities of the internet. I also feel very passionately that we need to really look at how to invest in producers across this country and change some of the criteria for Canadian content, really build an effective co-production regime so companies can find their markets, which are primarily, not only in Canada, but primarily now international markets for many forms of content, and really do some creative thinking about what happens with the next ISPs that are coming on board in the mobile space. So I want to come back to those, but you can't just not regulate. You have to do a whole set of other things that happen side by side. I also want to talk about issues of the right for free speech and copyright, because I think we're moving into a very rigid copyright regime in Canada that doesn't serve the 21st century. So lots to talk about.
Sonny?
I feel like I'm in the Roman Colosseum. Thumbs up, thumbs down. It's a little daunting. In terms of the way I look at this, first of all, the question isn't whether the internet should or shouldn't be regulated, has it or has it not been regulated. Parts of the internet have been regulated, tariff pricing, things like this. But what we're talking about here is a decision about content that flows over the internet in Canada. And the reality is, what the CRTC said 10 years ago was that they thought that the internet was in its infancy, that it should be allowed to grow and flourish, a decision I think everybody would probably have agreed with at the time, and certainly in hindsight made sense. They're kind of using a bit of the same language today, but the reality is that they can't regulate the internet. That's really the problem. They've been given charge with regulating a broadcasting system that's very important to Canada. It definitely raises a lot of debate, Canadian content issues, et cetera. How do you fund the thing? However, the internet is gradually grabbing audience away from that, and they're facing a problem. And so what you see in the latest decision is the CRTC saying, we want the internet to continue to grow and evolve and all that. But the reality is they can't do anything about it. How are they supposed to stop outside Canada content from coming in? How are they supposed to apply the regulations and the regulatory scheme they've got for broadcasters to foreign content providers? The reality is that they can't. And yet they are watching everything around them crumble. And so you also see in this decision grasping for help and saying we need a holistic new media policy and digital strategy for Canada. This is a cry for help from our regulator. They're also throwing the ISP question into the federal court. They're saying, listen, so there's a bit of pass the buck going on, and you can understand why you're doing it. So I think that everybody at the end of the day today is probably going to come out of this session with the same sort of idea. We need something to be done. That doesn't mean draconian regulation or anything. Maybe it means no regulation, but we need somebody to look at this at a holistic level. That's copyright, broadcasting, telecom, and all of the related areas, and for a strategy to be developed.